Good afternoon. My name is Jennifer Jihe Chun, and on behalf of the International Institute at UCLA, it is my great pleasure to welcome you to today's event, Remembering 1992 After the 2020 Rebellions. I'm thrilled to have two highly distinguished and brilliant scholars, Professors Claire Jean Kim and Gay Teresa Johnson, join us in what is sure to be a riveting conversation, curated by the incomparable Dr. Elizabeth Rubio. To begin, please join me in acknowledging our presence on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Gabrielino Tongva peoples. As a land-grant institution, we at UCLA are grateful to have the opportunity to work for the Turak Hatom, indigenous peoples in this place. And we pay our respects to the Hanukvatam ancestors, Ahihirom elders, and Iyu Hinkan relations, past, present, and emerging. Today's event is part of a year-long webinar series entitled Global Racial Justice and the Everyday Politics of Crisis and Hope. This series builds on conversations that began back in the fall of 2020, inspired by the historic global movement for Black lives. At that time, tens of millions of people took to the streets to demand an end to police brutality, state violence, and systemic racism. It's been almost 2 years now, and the need to continue these conversations could not be more urgent. As is too often the case, the backlash has been swift and it's ongoing, well-resourced, and toxic. Yet it also reminds us of the need to continue to revisit history and the past, and especially the importance of recognizing the long, enduring, and overlapping struggles that have taken place both locally and globally for a more just, dignified, and an emancipatory world. Before I turn it over to Dr. Rubio to lead today's conversation, which takes place on the anniversary of the 1992 Los Angeles Uprisings, I wanted to offer some brief words of thanks. This series would not be possible without the indispensable support and commitment of the International Institute, led by Vice Provost for International Studies and Global Engagement, Cindy Fan, and Associate Vice Provost, Marjorie Orianov. Deepest thanks to the hard work and dedication of amazing International Institute staff who also do all the behind the scenes work to make events like today possible, including Alex Zhu, who is behind the scenes with us today, offering invaluable tech support, Peggy McKerney, Chloe Huiga, Warren Berkey, Kayan Mentasawu, and others who've been with us actually this entire 2 years. We're also grateful to our co-sponsor, the Asian American Studies Center. So now to our main event. I couldn't be more thrilled to introduce our discussant, Dr. Elizabeth Rubio, who's really the driving intellectual force behind today's conversation and event. Dr. Rubio received her PhD in cultural anthropology at UC Irvine, and she currently holds the Chancellor's Postdoctoral Fellowship in the Institute for American Cultures and Asian American Studies Center at UCLA. She is writing what will sure to be a groundbreaking ethnographic study of undocumented Korean American organizers in Southern California, Washington, DC, and Chicago, with a focus on the fraught politics of multiracial coalition building in immigrant justice spaces and the complexities of enacting immigrant justice through an abolitionist lens. Not only can you find Dr. Rubio's publications and important scholarly outlets such as Amerasia, the Journal for the Anthropology of North America, and the Los Angeles Review of Books, among others, she brings a wealth of insight and experience based on her work as a community organizer and also doing mutual aid work. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Rubio.
Hi, everybody. Thank you, Dr. Chun, for that wonderful introduction and generous introduction. Dr. Chun has really been instrumental in pulling all of the different university resources together to make this possible. And I just want to express my gratitude for all of that work. And also, of course, to the International Institute and the Asian American Studies Center. So I have the pleasure today of introducing our two wonderful panelists. I'm going to do those introductions, then provide a few introductory remarks just to kind of frame our discussion for today. Then I'll go in directly to our questions, which we will discuss about 45 minutes or so. Then we will open up to questions from you all in the audience. So please be taking advantage of the Q&A function throughout the panel. We'll try to get to all of them or most of them. You can also upvote questions that you would like to see addressed first. So with us today, we have Dr. Gay Teresa Johnson, who is an associate professor and core faculty member at UCLA's African American Studies Department. She writes and teaches on race and racism, cultural history, spatial politics, and political economy. Her first book is Spaces of Conflict, Sounds of Solidarity, Music, Race, and Spatial Entitlement in Los Angeles. And her current work includes The Futures of Black Radicalism, co-edited with Alex Lubin, and a book I'm very much looking forward to, These Walls Will Fall, Protest at the Intersection of Immigrant Detention and Mass Incarceration. Dr. Johnson has also contributed journal articles and book chapters to historical, cultural studies, and ethnic studies volumes. And she's been a visiting researcher at Stanford's University Center for the Comparative Study of Race and Ethnicity and at the African Leadership Academy in Johannesburg, South Africa. She's active with the Los Angeles Community Action Network's Struggle for Housing and Civil Rights on LA's Skid Row, for which she earned the 2013 Freedom Now Award. Dr. Johnson serves on the board of directors for the Central Coast Alliance United for a Sustainable Economy, or CAUSE, and on the advisory board for the Rosenberg Fund for Children. So thank you so much, Dr. Johnson, for being with us here today. We also have with us one of my mentors, Dr. Claire Jean Kim, who is a professor of political science and Asian American studies at the University of California, Irvine, where she teaches classes on race, politics, animal, and ecology. She's the author of 2 award-winning books, Bitter Fruit, The Politics of Black Korean Conflict in New York City, and Dangerous Crossings, Race, Species, and Nature in a Multicultural Age. Her third book, another one I'm very much looking forward to, is Asian Americans in an Anti-Black World, which is forthcoming from Cambridge University Press in early 2023. Dr. Kim has been a commentator on MSNBC and NPR, and her popular writing has appeared in the Los Angeles Times, The Nation, and Miss Magazine. She's currently working on a book about Asian Americans and the pending case Students for Fair Admissions v. Harvard, which may end race-conscious admissions in US higher education. So I can think of no 2 better interlocutors to have this discussion today. And I'm just going to, again, provide just some opening remarks before we move to the questions. So we come here today, as you all know, on the 30th anniversary of the 1992 LA Uprising, a commemoration that also coincides with a moment of renewed public discourse about Black urban rebellion, policing in prisons, violence in Asian American communities, and the conditions that necessitate thinking these issues as extensions of one another. But at the same time, contemporary narratives about these issues reflect both a departure from and stubborn adherence to the imaginative constraints that marked collective analysis of 1992 and its immediate aftermath. The carceral responses to recent attacks against Asian Americans, framed as instances of interpersonal hate rather than state violence, echo the analytical enclosures imposed by the Black Asian conflict frame. At the same time, the already emergent liberal attempt to equate Derek Chauvin's incarceration with justice for George Floyd recalls the misreading of 1992 as a riot against an isolated and aberrant judicial outcome, rather than an uprising against the anti-Black foundations of the carceral state. So the central question driving our discussion today is, how do the politics of collective memory around 1992 matter in our efforts to remember and stave off attempts to misremember 2020? And it was motivated to focus this discussion on the relationship between urban rebellion and collective memory, really after reading scholar and writer Toby Hazlitt's summer 2021 essay, Magic Actions, Looking Back on the George Floyd Rebellion. In that essay, Hazlitt argues that just a year after the largest and most widespread uprisings in US history, the forces of liberal revisionism were already attempting to misremember what the fiery, explosive, and abolitionist uprisings as a series of nonviolent protests based on reformist maneuvers within the same carceral logics that produced George Floyd's murder. Hazlitt writes, quote, "It's been a year, long enough for the events to be flattened and foreshortened, long enough for the authorities to paint their account over the true one. At the DNC last fall, we saw how the uprising may be remembered. A sunny, noble blur of soaring rhetoric and peaceful crowds, a fabulous alternative to the rawness on the ground," end quote. But at the same time, Hazlitt says, memories of certain scenes on the ground across the country in 2020, autonomous zones, police cars and precincts on fire, mutual aid formations, housing cooperatives, have all exceeded attempts at liberal recapture. Again, turning to Hazlitt's words, quote, "But certain facts remain. Some things can't be wished away. Too much was born and broken amid the smoke and screams. The least we can do is remember." So in the 30 years since, there has been no shortage of attempts to reconstruct and make sense of what happened in the streets of LA in 1992. But in some cases, these reconstructions have flattened into a series of overdetermined narratives, sealed into our minds through certain images and sounds repeated ad nauseum. The grainy video footage, armed Korean Americans on rooftops, Florence and Normandy in flames, the pronouncement, "Can't we all just get along?" And so with all this in mind, the questions motivating us today are, why do we remember these images and not others? What lay in excess of these tropes? What are the interplays between power and collective memory as they show up in our commemorations of 1992? And why might they matter towards fighting back a deliberate liberal forgetting of the political imaginations the 2020 rebellion ignited, the new solidarity formations they birthed, and the breadth of the logics they challenged? So with that, I would love for Dr. Johnson and Dr. Kim to kind of join us on screen. Thank you. And so I just wanted to start with an opening question, kind of situating you all and your research in this kind of historic moment. Both of you have written so extensively about Black rebellion and urban multiracial conflict and coalitions. So I was wondering if you could talk about how 92, not just the 5 days themselves, but the entire confluence of pressures and historical processes leading up to them have kind of informed your scholarly trajectory, your activist work, and how your own backgrounds in turn kind of inform those approaches. Who would like to go first? Dr. Johnson?
Sure, happy to. First, thank you so much for organizing this. And I just want to acknowledge all of the people that came to be in conversation. So even though we can't see you, we very much feel your presence. So thank you for being here. It's such a great question for me and my earlier work, especially in my first book. 1992 was pivotal because as I participated in mass protests as a college student, I heard Latinx and Black people urging a kind of coalition politics that in many folks' words had never happened before. And I knew from my own lived experience that that was untrue. So it set me on this path of wanting to uncover a history that was, in my view, never really hidden by our people anyway, but somehow out of sight of even some of the most visionary folks. So LA being what it was and is historically as a multiracial city, and its demographic and geographic organization that occasion different kinds of relational understandings, but also segregation among marginalized groups, made me want to write a different kind of history, but one that I also knew was always already there. And it helped me understand the importance of what I often echo in Cedric Robinson's work on racial capitalism, which is that one of the most important characteristics of racial regimes is a hostility to its own discovery. And I was interested in how the state violence and segregation created a forgetting that was weaponized against us, but I also wanted to lift up the truth that generations of organizers already knew, and also healing practitioners already knew.
Thank you so much for that, Dr. Kim.
So thanks, Liz and Jennifer and Gay and everyone who's here. I'm really happy to join the conversation today. You're taking me back, Liz, with this question to my dissertation, which was on the Red Apple boycott, a Black nationalist and Haitian-led protest against 2 Korean produce stores in Brooklyn in 1990, so right before the LA Rebellion. And I went into that project thinking that I knew the answer already, which is that Black people were scapegoating Korean merchants. And that was sort of the conventional wisdom and in the media, and that's what I thought was true. So I went into the project thinking that, and I really had my intellectual life sort of turned upside down by talking to, in particular, the people who were the leaders of the boycott, who were some Haitian activists, but many of them had been longtime Black nationalist, internationalist activists, and listening to their understanding of the world, their critique of the US, and their particular understanding of this set of events around the boycott really changed how I saw the world. And so the first book, Bitter Fruit, came out of that. And I thought that I was sort of done at that point with this set of issues and wrote a second book on animals and ecology, and then found I really wasn't quite done because as I continued to educate myself on slavery and scholarship in Black studies, I started to rethink the racial triangulation argument that I had made in the first book. And so I started the second book, Asian Americans in an Anti-Black World, where my purpose is to say it's not important just to look at white supremacy and how we know white supremacy sort of divides and conquers groups of color, but it's also important to look at anti-Blackness as a separate, as a related but separate force that is abjecting Blackness in a very unique way. And how can we think about these two forces together, working together? How do they articulate in addition to, along with racial capitalism, as Gay mentioned? So that's been the charge of the recent book, which I just completed.
Thank you so much for that. Yeah, I mean, one of these, I've been talking about one of these kind of narratives that gets consolidated into common sense that then seems to rise above the level of critique is this kind of narrative that, Korean Americans were necessarily innocent bystanders in this war between Black and white that they had nothing to do with, and your, kind of collective complications of that are helping to unsettle that narrative. And we're going to get to that a little bit more in detail. But for now, as I discussed in my opening comments, there's I remember coming to LA, right when I came to LA from the East Coast was during the 25th anniversary. And you see kind of the same images during these commemorations kind of circulated over and over again. Or also, at the time in the media, of course, the video footage, this, the kind of the same photos of the armed Koreans on the rooftops, so-called looters coming out of storefronts, et cetera. And I was hoping you all could reflect a little bit on why these images are the ones or the images or sounds for you, Dr. Johnson, are the ones that kind of circulate. What those have to do with the narratives that coalesce to structure a collective memory of 92, and what, if anything, these narratives get wrong, and kind of what other sounds and formations and images would you rather see kind of be the ones that we associate most with 1992? I don't know if Dr. Kim, you wanted to start, and please feel free to respond to each other as well.
Go ahead, Claire. Go ahead.
I think when you say public memory, so I'm assuming you mean the mainstream public as opposed to counter publics or, yeah. So I think we can think of public memory as sort of an ideological artifact, right? It is a condensed form of mainstream ideology. It is like the handiwork of power. So we look at the public memory of the events of 92, and they're very distorting of what actually happened, and that's not a surprise to us, right? So you mentioned what kinds of images we might think instead of those images, and I think one of the most powerful impacts of 92 for me and many other people was kind of losing faith in the power of the visual and how the visual can intervene in political activism or movements for justice. Because I remember when the videotape of the beating of Rodney King came out and people said, now we're fine, we've got them. Like we have the police on record and now everyone can see what they did. And of course the officers were acquitted anyhow, despite the fact that the jurors saw the footage. Now, Kim Crenshaw has, of course, this, and Gary Peller have that wonderful piece where they talk about it's because the defense attorneys broke down the footage into individual stills that helped to sort of dispel the impact of the images and gain the acquittal. But also, when we look at Saidiya Hartman's argument about the spectacularization of anti-Black violence and how important it is not to reproduce that kind of violence by treating violence against Black people in this society, whether by the police or civilians, as a spectacle. So the circulation, let's say, of the shooting deaths, right, by the police of Walter Scott or other people, the problem, how problematic that is for people to be viewing that on their phones, et cetera. So my preference is to think about the kinds of frameworks we can come up with to rethink and critique some of these stock images in the public memory that you mentioned. And, we have, looking back at Gay's edited volume, we have, ideas from Angela Davis and Kim Crenshaw and Ruth Gilmore and many others who they all give us the tools, the theoretical tools to be able to think about these events in a different way than the mainstream wants us to think about, and specifically to think about the events in the long-term trajectory of the Black liberation struggle and how that struggle is always evolving. It's always there, right? It waxes and wanes. It takes different shape at different times, but it's always there. And the LA Rebellion is situated very clearly in that pattern, in that dynamic, and that the state is always trying to contain, repress, delegitimate, criminalize, right? It has a sort of stock set of techniques or tactics that it uses to try to shut down any kind of Black protest of any variety, nonviolent or, quote unquote violent. So, or anything in between. That very binary, of course, violent or nonviolent being one of the tactics of delegitimation that the state uses. So if we can sort of make use of the frameworks that some of these scholars have provided and that movement activists themselves provide, then I think that we can speak back to some of that public memory, while understanding public memory is by definition, as I said, it's an artifact of power. But you asked what things we could put in its place. One thing I'd like to propose that we think about, because I just finished this book, which is historically based, is when we look at 1992 and we say there are these protests or actions taken against Korean store owners in LA, then I think we need to ask why 100 years earlier in the 1920s, we have the same kind of situation with Chinese store owners in Rosedale, Mississippi. So for any of you who are law students or lawyers, the Supreme Court case Gangnam v. Rice, 1927, where Chinese American plaintiffs were saying in Jim Crow, Mississippi, we want our Chinese American children to go to school with white kids, not the so-called colored schools. So they lost the case. But what was really interesting for me in doing the research on that case was how much the situating of the Chinese merchant in Jim Crow, Mississippi was similar to, so many of the same dynamics as the Korean immigrant in LA in 1992. And so 100 years have gone by. And we have that same kind of structural situation with Black abjection and other groups coming in, Asian and other groups coming in, and being able to get a foothold where Black people are denied that foothold, and the kinds of structural conflicts that can create. So I'd like to propose that we think about it in terms of that longer trajectory.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that. That was wonderful. So I agree. I feel like these structures of memory that are always constructed for us, like there are a few that rise to we could say the bottom, like sink to the bottom, rise to the top, so that we get this collage of like visual, sonic, spatial indictment that's not just an indictment of the state, because while yes, people talk about, oh, we got this on camera, which then was like this really big thing. I mean, who had a video camera just like laying around? This was this is really extraordinary. And a huge difference between 92 and 2020, a huge difference in terms of intention, in terms of surveillance, in terms of witness, in terms of the impact and of these forms and instances of violence, and the way that the public is able then to stitch together its own genealogy of state violence through images and through sounds in a way that is an alternative offering to the state-sanctioned structure of memory. So, it works. All of these things are an indictment of the state, but there's also a way that the same images and the same sounds and the same kind of spatial indictments are used against us as well. So the images that you offer are very powerful and have served as a source of incredible and generative critique of the state. And they have also been used against us time and again. And when you put them all together, it creates this collage of judgment, of relevance across different, not only times, but spaces that connect the border wall to the streets of South Central Los Angeles, that connect the rooftop of a Korean-owned store to the floor of the floor of an apartment building where someone is giving birth, for example. There are so many issues that are intersecting in these genealogies of memory that are using tropes that have always been used against us around reproductive injustice, around mass incarceration, gender violence. So there's that. There's the sort of, at least with a multidimensional aspect of analyzing these different kinds of texts. And I feel like the scholarly work on this has been incredible. But also the movement leaders and organizers and artists who have forced us to rethink those things, and therefore rethink the histories that are associated with them and the tropes that are associated with them, have been even more stellar in many respects. So the images and the sounds and the relationships that we create, and I say we, I mean those of us who are dreaming expansively of a much more justice-informed future, one that's not perfect, one that understands the nature of racial capitalism and hegemony as one that makes freedom a process and not a destination. So those things that we create, I think, are far more complex and more interesting. So then there's the kind of inverse of what we see with the weaponizing of this collage of visual and spatial indictment against us, where we create artistic renderings and expressions that, like, for example, the soundscapes that we hear in music that is inspired by the 92 rebellion, there's a marked change in how rap music, for example, uses the staccato of gunshots, or the sound of helicopters, or the sound of police talking on the radio, the truncated and staccato sounds of sirens. So there's an acknowledgement of the presence always there of, and the understanding that these communities are ones that are characterized by surveillance, constant surveillance, and also a very thin wall between home life and incarceration. Lastly, I know we need to move to the next question. What would be the things that we might like to see figuring more prominently in public memory? I mean, I think that we don't have to look too far. We see these things in backyard barbecues, in queer quinceañeras, in illegal punk shows, in the complexity and the contradiction of the labor of coalition, not just the difficult conversations, but also the commitments by just health workers, birth workers, folks who have somatic commitments to embodying, to referring to the embodied trauma, and not just as a spectacle, but as something that is a source of strength that Black people, that brown people, that Asian people can draw upon. So those images are here waiting for us, especially us as scholars. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you for that beautiful response. And I might ask you, either whether it be in the chat or something, to kind of, because, you're a scholar of musicology and whatnot, to kind of, if you would drop some of the kind of cultural or productions, formations that you think that folks that kind of came out of 1992 or in some way related to it, that you think folks might not know about. So whenever, but, you talking about, the kind of unseen and less spectacular coalitional formations, kind of brings me back to this question of the kind of confluence of the 2022 uprisings with this surge of public attention to acts of violence against Asian Americans has kind of created this resurgence of 1992 era interest in understanding processes of multiracial solidarity and conflict. We have kind of the resurgence of the Asian Letters for Black Lives, which Claire, I know you feel a way about, and I'll let you, I do too, kind of genre. And Dr. Johnson, you've written so extensively as well about kind of the challenges, but also the joys and the transformative potential of, Black and Chicano Latino coalitional formations in LA. Dr. Kim, you've taken a really essential critical perspective on what are sometimes uncritically celebratory Black Asian coalitional formations, both immediately post 1992 and in Brooklyn as well, and in the contemporary moment. So I'm wondering if you've kind of seen any changes in the trajectory between now and 1992 in the ways that academics, activists, and the broader public talk about effective multiracial coalition, and what we imagine to be its transformative potential, if at all, in the past 30 years. And kind of what are the discourses and practices and broader visions of these coalitional formations you've seen emerge in response to 92, and kind of what things would you critique and find notable about any of those? Multi-part question, so you can take it wherever you want.
Do you want to start with this one?
Sure. One of the things that I appreciate the most about how far scholarship has come around these things is in the desire to be more brave about historicizing and engaging with all the possibility that is inside of these very complicated intersections. So what I think we see in these last 30 years are scholars who are trying to share a little bit more of the vision of activists by saying, what makes a movement go is a reckoning with those difficult pieces of coalition, is a reckoning with the ways that our knowledge has been truncated by what many people are encouraged to do historically, which is to refer back only as far as the civil rights movement and not back to some of the things that Claire is talking about with some of the cases that we see in the early 20th century or even before that. And in this case, I'm thinking of how the labor movement is so informative and so important for understanding that the spatial and organization of Black working life. And also then as we move into the second half of the 20th century and into the 21st century, the way that Latinx people are then integrated, but also we're always here. So the historical narrative of how they arrive is very much is very much inundated with a settler colonial vision of what, or its erasure, really, the erasure of that history in California, state history. So I see, and I find really encouraging, a whole crop of scholarship and people who are not afraid to confront those contradictions in their work, but also in the organizing work of folks. They're also not afraid to engage art and thinking about and within the public discourse as a really important and an essential part of scholarship. This shows a lot of potential, I think, and I look forward to, and I think this is where we're going. I look forward to more care around these relationships, the way that we understand ourselves as scholars on unceded land, and the way that we understand big ideas that like abolition as always evolving with our understanding of genocide and settler colonialism. So this is encouraging to me. Stop there.
So I think I'm glad you brought up the issue of anti-Asian violence. I wanted to just pause on that for a moment because I wanted to mention Janelle Wong's research on this and also her co-authored piece with Karthik Ramakrishnan, where they're looking at recent data on anti-Asian hate to correct a number of misconceptions. And I would really like to flag this because I think there's a broader story here about why the misconceptions exist, why they've been promoted. So number one, they indicate that even though, yes, there has been an uptick during the pandemic, the numbers seem, according to the media, much bigger than they actually are. For example, reporting an increase in reported hate crimes in New York City of an increase of 800% that went from something like 3 to 24, right? I mean, so sometimes the numbers have been quite small, but when the media headline is increased by 800%, people think we're talking tens of thousands of violent incidents. And a second thing that they point out is that up to 80% of the incidents are verbal harassment or social shunning. Now, to be entirely clear, any kind of anti-Asian discrimination is wrong. I hope this goes without saying, but I want to just say it to be clear. So I'm not in any way saying this is a good thing or this is tolerable, but I do want to help to correct the assumption that I think is mistaken, that there is this wave of extreme violence, even fatal violence against Asian Americans. Also, there's been a tendency in the media to emphasize that perpetrators as being Black. And this has been a real problem because the majority of perpetrators are white, according to Wong and Ramakrishnan. And number two, there have been 2 recent incidents in New York City of Asian American women being killed by Black men. And in both cases, it is not at all clear these were racially motivated incidents. There's no clear evidence that either was. In both cases, the alleged perpetrators had severe mental health problems and were in and out of homelessness. So my concern is that we're taking what is a problem of homelessness, a health crisis, mental health crisis, and a homelessness crisis, and turning it into a racial issue when it's not, the evidence is not there for those cases. And it's so, for doing this kind of research, people sometimes will, pointing these things out, people will sometimes be accused of being race traitors by Asian Americans. So I think it's really important, that we flag this issue, that it matters that we be accurate about what kind of harassment's going on, and who's doing it, and whether it is in fact racially motivated. One of the reasons I think it's important to correct some of those misconceptions is there's been a push by some Asian Americans during the pandemic to say, oh, well, we're receiving all of this hate from the public, so this puts us sort of in the same boat with Black people, and we should promote coalitions on this basis. And so, I saw a number of events organized on this basis by Asian American activists. And, my concern here is the equivalencing between what is happening to Asian Americans and what happens in the present and has happened since the era of slavery to Black people. And the book that I just finished is really, the central point of it is Asian Americans have been positioned from 1850 to the present, and with no end in sight, as not white, but above all not Black. And that their not Blackness has been a kind of property, aka, or rather sort of similar to Cheryl Harris's argument about whiteness as property. It's been a form of property that has allowed certain types of exemptions or advantages in different kinds of situations. And to go back to Alicia Garza's herstory of the Black Lives Matter movement, she has a passage in there that a lot of people don't talk about that I think is really important, where she says that non-Black communities of color benefit from anti-Black racism. And she doesn't go into great detail there, but I think that that's an incredibly important passage, and I think it's very important she stated that. And in many ways, I'm trying to show in my book the ways that Asian Americans historically have benefited from being not Black, and the ways they get weaponized against the Black movement and also weaponize themselves against the Black movement. None of which is to deny the tremendous activism and, scholarship within the Asian American community that's very progressive and tries to be in solidarity with the Black struggle. So it's, that's all, of course, true as well. But my concern is that when we talk about coalitions, we're not talking about those differentials in power and status that have been there, I think, from the first Chinese laborers coming to California in the 1850s, then we are missing the sort of what the structural framework for coalitions and what's possible. In terms of post-2020, I've seen more interest among younger Asian Americans in really trying to get at the bottom of how Asian Americans should think about themselves in relation to anti-Blackness. So, on the one hand, it's been, let's look in our hearts and our communities, let's look inside at what our anti-Black thoughts might be that we're not even aware of, but also more of an interest in looking at anti-Blackness as a structural feature of society and thinking about where Asians fit in relative to it. So I think Asians for Black Lives, although it's not post-2020, it was formed in response to Black Lives Matter's formation earlier, I think they set a very interesting example because they are talking about explicitly and at every moment talking about Asian Americans needing to be supportive of the Black struggle, understanding themselves in relation to the Black struggle, and not equivalencing between what happens to Asian Americans and what happens to Black people. So there are a number of groups that are, similar, although I would name them as a really interesting example of what can be done. And as a last point, I just wanted to say on the coalition front that one thing that concerns me is the coalition that's forming that we may not be paying full attention to, and that is a coalition between conservative Asian Americans and white conservatives that is happening. I'm thinking about this because I'm working on the Harvard anti-affirmative action case that the Supreme Court will hear in September. And, this might be the case. It could well be the case that ends race-conscious admissions in U.S. higher education. And it is being promoted by a a coalition, a coalescence of white conservative activists who are very well funded, such as Ed Bloom, who's also the person who's behind the Shelby County v. Holder case, which eviscerated the Voting Rights Act, right, which left us with the voting rights dilemmas we have now. On the one hand, Ed Bloom and his white conservative funders. On the other hand, affluent, professional, highly educated Chinese immigrants, some Korean immigrants as well, who have been incredibly organized and incredibly effective at developing themselves in the space of 10 or 15 years into a national anti-affirmative action fighting force. And they're fighting this battle in state legislatures, and now they're going to go up to the Supreme Court. They've been doing this at the level of secondary schooling, right, in high schools, in San Francisco, in Virginia, and elsewhere. So this is an incredibly important coalition that is, emerging and having a real impact. And I'm concerned that progressive and left-leaning Asian Americans really take stock of this and figure out how to speak back to this and figure out how to not have Asian Americanness be hijacked by some of these conservative groups.
Yeah, that's a really important point. And some of the your reference to these kind of uncritical coalitional formations can also complicate what I've been talking about, what's coalesced into this narrative of, Korean Americans had nothing to do with this battle, that they just stumbled into upon immigrating, and had no prior knowledge of any sort of the struggles of Black people in the United States. How can we hold that critique and have more of a class-based critique as well, while also not delegitimating, the very real fears that people held in those days. So I think we should pay more attention to that. So I just have one final question before we kind of open up the Q&A, which kind of has to do with I'm not, I was 4 in 1992. I don't have direct memories of it, let alone kind of any awareness of what people may have actually been in the streets demanding during those days, because we already see, like I referred to in the introduction, this like liberal forgetting that people, and at least the Minneapolis Police Department, people were actually not just calling to defund the police, but to abolish the police. And at least for a period of a few weeks, the Minneapolis City Council was taking this seriously, right? And so and whether or not how serious that was, but I'm wondering, what have we forgotten that folks in the streets in 1992 were actually asking? How is this kind of these kind of visions of freedom that people were fighting for in those days, how have they been kind of manipulated? How have they been forgotten in certain ways, in the similar way that we're seeing? And then, so that's one kind of the question. And then the second part of the question is that, we kind of are already seeing these narrations of 2020 as a failure. Minneapolis police were never defunded. Biden is in his first address to the nation saying the answer is more cops and not less. But kind of when we think about social movements in this very vulgar political sense, so much gets lost, right? So much gets lost in terms of the spaces of fugitivity, the imaginative openings that occur in the less spectacular moments, right? So the second part of the question is, what do we forget that 1992 or 2020 made possible in the imaginations and the political imaginations of those who took to the streets, even after the days when the most intense protests were done? What were folks yearning for? What were they responding to? And how are those kind of freedom dreams marked both by continuations and departure between 1992 and the 2020 rebellions?
You want to go first this time, or do you want me?
Whatever you prefer, Gay. What do you think?
Go ahead.
Okay. That's a compound question.
Sorry, yes.
So yes, so I think I'll speak as, a so-called political scientist. There is a tendency to say, well, if a movement hasn't achieved X and Y legislative goals, like the civil rights movement did, then it didn't succeed. And I think the best response to that is look at the Black Panther Party, right? They didn't have legislative goals, but we are still talking about the Black Panther Party a half century later, and they as part of the Black Power movement, as part of the longer Black liberation struggle, they reflected back on earlier activism in the 20th century, earlier Black internationalist activism. They're carrying those themes forward and reflecting that larger struggle, and we still are talking about those themes. So I see both 1992 and 2020, I'll mention what I think are some differences in a moment, but I see both of them as moments in that larger narrative, right, of Black liberation struggle in the United States and across the world, because of course the 2020 events in particular inspired and ended up being connected to Black liberation struggles, anti-colonial struggles around the world. So I see them both in that tradition, and I see them as continuing to keep our imaginations alive to what possibilities there are politically for a different kind of world, right? A different kind of living. And, that's what, when I look at movement activists then and now, I mean, that's what they bring to the table. I think scholars are good at critique and scholars are good at retrospective analysis, not so good necessarily at the imagination of what could be different. And going back to, Gay's point about capitalism, I think it was Mark Fisher who said it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism, right? So how do we imagine a world that is fundamentally different and has been fundamentally restructured? And here I think, one of the key differences between 1992 and 2020 is, even though neoliberalism was well underway in 1992, we see in 2020, even more, decades more of the impact of neoliberalism on poor Black communities. We also see epidemiological violence, right, in the form of COVID-19, this global pandemic that is having such disproportionate effects upon Black Americans. Just to stay within the US for a moment, if you look at the Color of Coronavirus report, until fairly late in the pandemic, it was Black Americans who were suffering the highest mortality rates. And there was an early article in The Guardian by a reporter talking about COVID in Chicago, and she said maybe we should consider Blackness a pre-existing condition, right? So that the disproportionate impact on Black Americans of COVID-19, I think, was a form of epidemiological violence. We have economic violence, state violence through the police, and all of these forms of violence converging to, produce and generate that kind of movement activity at that time. I also think one difference is in 2020, we're much more alive to the issues of global warming, of ecological crisis. And, for me, I think the most exciting way to think about environmental justice, climate justice, animal justice, a lot of these issues, is to think how these issues can come through, be generated through the Black movement. And, so I've been in circles lately speaking to some of the academic circles I'm in, where it's like climate justice, for example, where it's all white people and, from different parts of the world. And I talk about in those circles about how I think you can't have a climate justice movement that's not linked to, if not generated by, the global struggle for Black liberation. So how do we think about those things together?
Thank you. Yes, so powerful. In 92, a lot of what people were asking for was housing, after-school programs, drug rehabilitation centers, things that should be guaranteed under the democracy that Reaganism was promising through trickle-down economics, which of course never happened. What happens is a war on drugs, and people are sounding alarms they're actively and explicitly explaining what mass incarceration is doing to their communities, not only in terms of the removal of bodies from families and spaces, but also in terms of the way that mass incarceration and all of its logics are informing the relationships between people who are marginalized increasingly throughout the 1990s and beyond. And I think what we see is a robust movement in 92 that comes together that is incredible. The gang truce with very specific steps, with attribution to movement organizers, to mothers, to folks who had never been exposed in many respects to the idea of all the different kinds of contours of freedom, and yet still had these dreams of freedom and knew from their own experience in these spaces of repression what it might look like to have everything you need to succeed. People refused the false binaries of choice. They became, I felt like the evolution of public discourse around choice, around, is it a legitimate choice to have to wonder about dinner or breakfast? Is it a legitimate choice to wonder whether or not we should rescind money to mothers who, to working class and low income mothers who are on some form of assistance? Should we refuse them reproductive rights, or should we, or do we take away this money? These are the kinds of, I think, conversations that start to come to the fore that are really encouraging. And also it makes it all the more difficult to look back on what ends up happening when the gang truce is destroyed, is ignored. I mean, ignoring is actually even worse in many respects. In the rise of power among prosecutors and chief of police, and then the legacy of that, because there's been a lot of generations since then of power in these spaces, but it's very traceable. So it's a difficult moment post 92, even though, as coming back to the images that you talked about, more and more we see this engagement with multiculturalism and as a false panacea, as an offering to excuse society for all of its genocidal, the continuation of genocide in many forms. It's interesting because what we see is the dream of conservatives and Reagan, Thatcher, and we see that dream realized in such an insidious way, in ways that many of us could not have predicted, with the very particular digital oppression and harassment that Safiya Noble talks about, that so many folks have been talking about, with even the way that power then escalates through Amazon and so many other different multinational multinational corporations that then participate in state surveillance through ring cameras, through hiring CIA, former CIA folks to do security for them. It's talking about Microsoft and Amazon. We see by 2020 the same kinds of use of the bodies of marginalized people, this time in the form of using them as essential workers, while rich people go off to places that feel immune from the pandemic. It's just a different form, but it's so much more visible in 2020. And it's, as Kianga Yamada Taylor says, the optics are extremely cruel, especially in this respect. This is why in 2020, it doesn't matter. The people are so displaced because of gentrification, because of the this conservative, the manifestation of this conservative dream, the dispersal of jobs, the eviction, the mass evictions of people, the narrowing of opportunities for young people, the narrowing of possibilities in education and so many other ways, and then immigration as the spectacle of and the ghost of what actually troubles Black people. So these are all things that I think they help us to understand 2020 and 1992, not necessarily as a one-to-one, but instead as this sort of continuum of state violence. But then coming back to your question I guess maybe one more little thing before that is that I think about often with something that I always use is C.L.R. James's characterization of the Cold War as a time where the nation like transforms from talking about protection to security. So it's like you can no longer rely on protection and service, but instead now you can rely on security and enforcement. And so a lot of people turn to, with infrastructures in cities disintegrating, a lot of people turn to policing as the ideal source of protection and service. And instead we get security enforcement and murder and state-sanctioned violence. And we see that happening again and again. We think about the legislation following the 9/11 attacks that happened through lawmakers, swiftly expanding the country's prosecutorial and surveillance powers. What happens when immigration comes under the Department of Homeland Security under Obama, and the irreparable damage that these long events cause. And there's so many more things, but I just want to say that when we think about how Black, Brown, Asian, so immigrants, all the folks who are marginalized by the sort of heteropatriarchy, the racial capitalism that is now like on steroids where nothing really has value or meaning longer than for a snapshot, a meme, and where the underpaid labor of Black workers and the characterization of laborers as not even worth a living wage or meaningful labor protections, as not worthy of being housed. The lack of investment in our lives is seen as then this, not a public failure, but a private burden. And then now we need to somehow understand how we fail to meet the dream of California, and how if we could just participate in that dream, which is imagined as like as democratic, as aspirational, then maybe we wouldn't have ourselves to blame. Now, there's all these incredible moral visions that are connected and concerned with like the root causes and the expansiveness of a future that is rooted in care and radical democracy. And I think some of those things that we're seeing right now that are exciting are, this shifting focus from being displaced to being housed, to thinking about self-determination, different kinds of creative communities and co-ops, the remaking of our value, the demand that we of ourselves for accountability, to connect our own banishment to the kind of practices of brutality that we see so flagrantly flaunted, enjoyed as trauma porn, and then forgotten the next day. So I think today we dream a little bit differently, and we dream under a different kind of urgency, and within the violence of mass media as well. So I am really, I'm as ever, I'm convinced that the most powerful solutions and resolutions come from the folks who are experiencing these things in an embodied way, but also have the bravery and courage to refuse the end of hope and as something that is easier, as Claire was talking about, like it is easier to imagine than the end of capitalism. There are people who refuse that as a matter of their own regeneration and rejuvenation. And that's the kind of books I think we want to be down with.
I guess, Liz, I just wanted to mention one example that I think captures what Gay was talking about, or at least some of what she's talking about really well, which was that moment early in the pandemic when it was shown that the number of COVID cases was rapidly rising among Black women and undocumented immigrants who were the main workforce for poultry processing plants and in the South, and that Trump declared they had to stay open, right? Because this was critical infrastructure, the meat processing plants. They had to stay open. And not only did he therefore force these people to keep coming to work, even though they were worried about dying from COVID, he then passed some kind of order that absolved the poultry processing plant owners from any legal liability if their employees should get sick. Right. So if they get sick and die, their families can't sue the company, saying you exposed us to this. So talk about like this moment where it was very, very clear under racial capitalism just how little value, right, these workers had.
Yeah, thank you for that example, Claire. And I was thinking you were talking earlier about just kind of even the epidemiological violence and how we just need to dream bigger. I mean, George Floyd, when they conducted his autopsy, he was positive for COVID-19 and there was fentanyl in his system, right? Talk about like converging crises, you know what I mean? In the literal body of someone who was such the blatant target of state violence. And Gay, just your invocation that the dreaming is structured not around the demand, but questioning the logics of the demand and the logics of the things that folks think that is a legitimate choice. I can think of no other kind of beautiful way of saying that. So thank you for that. We do have a question if it's okay if we turn to that. And I encourage folks to continue to ask questions because we have about 20 minutes left. So the question, I'm sorry, I can't see who it's from, but the question is that when we began this webinar series, the explosion of people into the streets that the BLM movement led created a powerful awakening and reverberation, showing us the vital political spaces that movements pry open. Now, as we're in this moment of movement delegitimization, criminalization, and appropriation, how do you see movements trying to contest these processes? This is a wonderful question. And how does our teaching and research need to adapt when more spectacular forms of public mobilization has receded? Thank you to whoever wrote that question. Yeah. Oh, sure. Let me put it in the chat. It will, Jennifer, do you mind putting that in the general chat? Because, okay, there we go. So how are movements themselves contesting these processes of delegitimization and criminalization?
Liz, do you think that you could speak to that? Because I know from your scholarship and your activism that you're dealing with those issues.
Yeah. I mean, something that connects like 1992 and 2020 in my mind is, just the concentration on, kind of like the liberal refrain of, okay, people are angry. We understand why people are angry, but do they have to resort to violence? Do they have to resort to looting? And what the narrative that I see kind of movement spaces using to contest that is like, I think one popular, I'm not very active on Twitter, but like one phrase I saw repeated over and over again, especially during the height of 2020, was who is looting whom, right? And kind of indicting this big, again, what Gay was talking about questioning the logics of the perceived legitimacy of the choice, right? Of you have been looting. You are the structure of racial capitalism is the active looter of our communities. We are taking what we need to survive. And actually, that's a central part of the movement, right? That is essential. Questioning that logic is not a tangential part of why people are on the streets. It's saying we do not need what we have to survive because we're being actively looted by a carceral logic that serves to protect property and not human well-being. So that for me is a very powerful way that I see folks kind of pushing back against that. And then in terms of, spectacular, when the spectacular forms of public mobilization has receded, this is when we need to see like the, some of the work that folks do, for example, with the People's Coalition in Orange County. I think some folks are here today from that mutual aid organization that does mutual aid work with unhoused folks in Orange County, doing harm reduction, grocery reclamation, et cetera. You see how much work this takes. I try to be active and I cannot keep up with this, but this is the work that's happening every day. And these are the structures to emerge that are people doing the kind of quiet work in the background, but that's where the transformative work happens. When you see that people have access to Narcan and fentanyl testing strips and people have access to food, you see that this is the spaces of revolution and that we actually can do these things in these structures. Like abolition is not just in the future, it's actually now also. And it's in the everyday and the ways that we interact with each other. So we need to be highlighting those kinds of formations that are kind of in the longue durée and not just these spectacular moments of protest. Sorry, yeah.
I love that. I feel like you said it all there. It's beautifully said and really, really important. And it inspires me too, to think about how we also, as scholars in institutions that are themselves complicit in violence, need to think independently and together about how we liberate resources and where our scholarship is helpful. Because especially in this moment, when we're thinking about gerrymandering, when we're thinking about this Roe v. Wade, when we're thinking about all of these places where we may lose a lot, like where we thought it was bad in 2016 to 2020, and we are looking at the seeds sprouting of what appointing judges during Trump's presidency means. So given that, this is an urgent time for scholars, not just to change the ways that we think, but to change the functionality of our work and to rethink what it means to be, especially in a public university. This is why I think the work that this panel does, that this series does, that Ananya Roy does, that so many folks that we have and just our institution are showing us. And I think they're good places to follow.
Yeah, I really appreciate both of your comments, Gay and Liz. And I would just add that as a scholar, like thinking about these, as you mentioned, spectacular moments of protest or activity, that part of what happens, part of what's important is having the power institutionally and individually to attribute meaning to those spectacular moments, right? And so I think that power is very much up in the air because our ability to do that, because of the Republican attacks on critical race theory, which they define as anything that, let's see, makes white people feel ashamed or guilty, or raises embarrasses the nation or makes it sound as though the nation is in some way fundamentally or essentially racist, right? So this, using that broad a definition, I think every single thing I teach would be kind of outlawed if I lived in a different state. So this is, I at first thought this was just maybe a couple of states, but this is now a growing thing. This is going, that clearly the way that the American Legislative Exchange Council works is ALEC, right? They take these state laws that succeed in one place and they, proliferate them and they spread them around to other states. And it's going to be a national effort to shut down people like having these kinds of conversations where we try to understand things that are going on with race and power and inequality and movements. And, I am concerned. I try to tell my students, hey, when, look at the things we're looking at in class. If you lived in a different state where they're outlining this, we would not be able to talk about these issues. Sure. And what happens to a society where you can't even talk about these issues? I mean, we know even though we have the nominal freedom to talk about them, how difficult it is to actually, speak to power. But imagine when the GOP has a little more success at this. So I feel like we can't take that for granted. And we have to fight for that too.
Yeah. Yeah. It's concerning. I don't know what else to say besides that. It's concerning. Our Q&A is blowing up. So from Jocelyn Luckett saying, thank you all, what an inspiring session. Can you both talk about what you see happening in ethnic studies programs on your campuses around these issues of coalition and difficult conversations? On my particular East Coast campus, post-2020, the conversations were consistently and frustrating, siloed along racial lines. Curious what you've experienced with deep gratitude, Jocelyn.
Jocelyn always brings amazing questions. So, I think what we saw right away was the desire for institutions to control the distribution of resources in just like in the wake of the rebellions of 2020, and that silo that Jocelyn is talking about is very real, in part because it's a pattern of behavior that we've learned under capitalism, that we go for what we feel is gettable in these conditions, and sometimes we don't. We're often tricked into staying in this pattern of scarcity that capitalism elevates. And in fact, Damien Sojourner writes so beautifully about this, that, the concept of time is one that's constructed. And we see in crises that folks in ethnic studies who are still responding as people who are subjects of capitalism. And so we don't often think as creatively as we can, or refuse the scarcity of time. So I think there have been some amazing conversations in institutions, at UCLA in particular, but also we have a lot to learn. And I think the frustration that's coming through in that question is really important, because so many of us write about these things, but then when it comes to actually doing the work, which is to say, we know the institution has these resources, we to give them is not a benevolent move. It is one that comes in response to a legitimate demand. And I think that the sharing of that sentiment needs to be much more pronounced, because there's also a window that many activists and folks that we admire, scholars we admire, talk about with respect to what has been given, and what and so we already see this in some of the particular kinds of cuts of support for graduate students, for adjuncts, for people, all the jobs that were cut during the pandemic, working people who keep the campus going. So what we need to see, I think, is a much more integrated conversation that takes into account all kinds of labor around community and scholarly endeavors, pursuits in institutions. What does that labor really look like? So who should be at the table to discuss what ethnic studies is and its connections to community?
So I thank you for the question, Jocelyn, and I sympathize with your frustration if you are expressing frustration. My experience has been that these are not easy conversations, and they don't happen very frequently. That's my personal experience, that as I've been writing this book, I've found mostly younger people in ethnic studies, like graduate students, have been very excited about the topic, but a lot of people who are older and more established have been less enthusiastic about it, because they fear that writing about Asian Americans' differential positionality with Black people undermines coalition and undermines, political possibilities. And my response to that is, I think it actually can enable coalition. It can actually clear the ground, right? Because we know that some of these issues need to be talked through, and some of these structures of power need to be addressed. I don't think that, I hope that the work has the opposite effect of being divisive and inhibiting coalition. But there are people have different kinds of investments, professional and political, and there are orthodoxies in ethnic studies, just like there are in any field. It is a human endeavor, right? And therefore there are ossified structures and orthodoxies and all kinds of things. And that's to be expected. So then the question is, like, who gets to, as Gay was saying, who gets to be at the table? Who gets to have, their voice heard in these conversations? And, I think it is important for people who have tenure, people who have more security of employment, to raise these issues and not put the burden just on people who are graduate students who are just coming up. I have a graduate student and an undergraduate I'm working with who are looking at anti-Blackness in the Chicano movement, and it's a tough subject, right? And I am concerned for them, because they're just starting out, and I don't know how their work is going to be received, even though I know that they're doing the work in good faith and that they're coming at it, with good intentions. I don't know how it will be received. So there are tensions and there are problems, and I think you're right to identify them. And I don't think it's an East Coast thing. I think it's a national thing.
Definitely a national thing. And something that I've observed, at least like in Asian American multiracial coalitional spaces, is that I think that, even just the time since I had my first grad seminar with you, Claire, in 2016 or something, to now, talking about kind of just differential racialization and how that affects in coalitional spaces. There's definitely more, at least a nominal awareness to it, and to the point where it creates this strange politics of deference that I don't think is helping us either, right? So that's a conversation for another time. We have, I think, time for one last question, which is coming from Alfredo Juante, saying, thank you so much. In 1992, Tom Bradley, LA's first Black mayor, was nearing the end of his 20-year tenure. The focus of his 5 terms as mayor focused largely on downtown development and economic development generally. In 1992, the housing crisis was already in full swing, and the neglect of social services was quite deep. And so what do you see the role of the next mayor given the looming mayoral elections? Should the memory of the 1992 uprising inform what the diversity of LA residents demand of the next gen of politicians? That is bringing up, oh wait, excuse me, I just gave you the previous question. So thinking about the upcoming mayoral elections in LA, Tom Bradley, had focused much of his career on downtown development. What should LA residents be demanding of the next mayor? And what might the lessons of the 92 uprising do for that?
Gay, do you want to begin?
Sure, I was going to say, go political scientists, go.
Yeah.
I'll be very brief. This is important. The timing of the election is very important, considering some of the things that earlier I was talking about. We're going to really see this fall, and then in the elections coming up, what those 4 years have done, and sometime preceding that. So yes, I mean, I say that the short answer is yes. The memory of the '92 uprising should inform what people demand of the next generation of politicians, because it's one of the most important uprisings in the world ever. And this is a time when we need to study it differently. We need to value the wisdom that came from this. And we need to gather all of the different kinds of knowledge and put them together into understanding why these very basic demands are going to make everybody win in LA: housing, food, childcare, protection for immigrants, asylum. All of these things are important for the city to win. I mean, right now, especially in places like Los Angeles, there's a lot of change underway that is usurping all of the resources, literally from the margins to what has been a takeover of the center. Mm-hmm. So even a greater takeover of the center. So all of the resources around climate change, water, all of these things are very important for not just the mayor, but for so many other elected officials. And it's our job to keep those visible.
I think I have the distinction of being the political scientist who pays the least attention to elections. So just to put that out there. But, one thing the question does accurately identify is the issue of racial representation, right? Tom Bradley being the first Black mayor of LA. And we can look at this across the country. And we really see this with Barack Obama as well, the ways that Black elected officials, even if they had the inclination to take on more progressive policies, are hemmed in various ways, starting with their electoral campaigns and then going into governance. So it's almost inevitable that their constituents will be, Black and non-Black, will be disappointed in what they try to do, because the fix is in, especially in a place like Los Angeles, where, interests like developers, they control the agenda. So I think, in terms of following up on Gay and sort of taking inspiration from 1992 and 2020, supporting progressive candidates. And I would say, in particular, one issue I'm really interested in is the study of slavery reparations, because California is a state that has appointed a commission. I believe we're the first in the nation to appoint a state commission to look into this issue. And, Harvard just released a report describing its involvement with slavery, and then discussing, raising the issue of how it can deal with that legacy. And I'm very glad to see that report come out right before the Supreme Court's going to consider affirmative action at Harvard, because I think these two issues are linked. But I think we can see something happening maybe on slavery reparations at the local and state level, since it seems a little jammed up at the national level. Mm-hmm. So that's something to think about. But overall, I guess I would want us to think about capitalism, supporting socialist candidates. And I'll leave you just with one question: is, can you see life on Earth surviving the ecological crisis if capitalism continues to have the hold on the planet that it does? Yeah. And if the answer is no, then we need to start wherever we have an inroad. And that might be in terms of trying really hard to elect left-leaning or socialist candidates to local office as well as higher office.
For sure. With that call to action, our time has come to a close. Thank you so much, Dr. Johnson, Dr. Kim, Dr. Chun. Thank you all for being here today. What a great conversation. Jennifer, did you want to say anything before we closed?
Yeah, I just wanted to just echo my thanks to you, Liz, and also to Claire and Gay for this really important and really necessary conversation for us to have now, especially on a Friday afternoon. I really appreciate just the space that you're opening up, and also the questions that you're asking. And just if, there are so many things for me to take away. And I just wanted to sort of highlight a few as we all sort of kind of move towards the weekend and reflect on this important conversation. I think one is, I was really struck by Claire, your emphasis on the importance of really historicizing. I think both you and Gay emphasize this, like there's political work in historicizing, and also being really accurate and paying attention to consequences and effects, because of always the ever-present dynamics of being appropriated and usurped. And I love, Gay, what you said about sort of what makes movements go. And I sort of took it as what makes movements go is not just like the mass protest and spilling out into the streets, but a reckoning with how our knowledges get truncated. Do you know what I mean? How they get, kind of back to the importance of historicizing, sort of usurped. And I think that's really important for us to remember, that that's also crucial movement work. And then, of course, staying on top of right-wing and conservative political formations. And, even though, Claire, I too, and I have to sort of get myself to pay much more attention to elections than social movements, not to say they're binaries, but we need to pay attention to these. And then kind of finally just remembering that the public university is a crucial site, and ethnic studies also within the public university as a crucial site for us to continue to struggle and push forward our visions and our demands. So thank you so much. And bye everyone. Thank you all of you for participating, and I look forward to seeing you again.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Bye.